All right. Jacqueline, I know you had received the questions before, and so I think you have a copy. But our first question for you is, as a survivor of sexual violence, can you speak a little bit about your disclosure process? Was the initial disclosure supportive, and to whom did you disclose? And did that first experience encourage you to seek more support or discourage you from wanting to pursue it?
Thank you for having me. My first disclosure was to my roommate as my assault happened on Rutgers property in our dorm. So whenever she got back, she was the first person I told. It was interesting because, she'd put her arm around me, but she was like, well, maybe you shouldn't have drank so much. And that was her first reaction, as I'm sitting there sobbing. So it was difficult. I did tell my parents, and then I disclosed to my therapist at the Rutgers Counseling Center. And immediately she was like, oh, well, that's a normal victim response. I was called a victim right away. That definitely didn't make me feel comfortable or make me feel good about myself because I couldn't bring myself to say the words, I was sexually assaulted or I was raped. I used the phrasing, I was taken advantage of because I didn't learn how to recognize it. And I was like, well, I don't remember, saying no. So does that count? Like I wasn't crediting myself. And after having my first disclosure, that definitely stuck with me. And then I chose not to disclose. I kept it. I stopped seeing my therapist after that. And then so this was 2013 when it happened. And then in 2016 is when I really started to process it in therapy. And then Hunting Ground came out, the documentary about sexual assault on college campuses. And I used to run a mentor program through the LGBTQ Center at Rutgers. So I screened that for the mentors, and I had so many feelings come up. And the counseling center actually came to kind of just break down what we just watched with all of the mentors there. And I didn't participate. And my therapist brought it up later when we had our session next week. And she's like, Jacqueline, I didn't want to call you out, but I know you usually talk a lot more. And I was like, yeah, I had a lot of feelings about it. And I was like, I think I need to report. Is it too late? And she was like, no, it's never too late. Like, even if it's out of the statute of limitations, like you have a right to report. So I reported it, and it was very difficult. It was essentially reprocessing my trauma all over again. I had reported it to Farzana Katadine at the Title IX office, but I was hesitant because I knew my case would go to the dean of student life. And that was somebody I had previously worked with in a professional capacity and didn't feel comfortable with him knowing about my case. So I want to say it went up to actually Scott. I think Scott had recently joined, if I'm not mistaken. So went up to there. So I didn't work with the dean I wasn't comfortable with. I mainly worked with Farzana, and that was really hard because it was requiring intricate details and recalling everything step by step. What was I wearing? How much was I drinking? So despite being told it wasn't why I was assaulted, having to have those questions asked is really re-traumatizing as well. So it was definitely hard. My case was open for about a year, and there was really no closure to it. So we just decided to close the case with the availability to open it up again if needed. So it's been difficult. I disclose it to partners whenever I have a partner, a romantic partner. So it's definitely been difficult. And but I finally did it, and I felt good after a while. It just took time.
Thank you for sharing that, Jacqueline. And I'm sure that not having a resolution probably affected you in some capacity as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I can imagine. And thank you for sharing that. I mentioned before, but certainly hearing it from you that the initial disclosure is so important, and that if it's not met with support and with validation, it can really have a long-term effect.
Yeah.
So the next question was, if you could, can you share with us the journey of your healing process? I know you shared just a little bit just now with us, and what that looked like for you. Has it been a straight upward trajectory, or have there been times where your healing process has been kind of derailed, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, it's definitely been derailed. I talk with my clients about how healing and recovery is not a linear process throughout your entire life, no matter what you're in recovery with. Um, I didn't really start my journey to healing until 2016. I always talk about how I want to thrive with my therapist, and I was just surviving up until I really started to process it. I push back a lot of my feelings, and that, can even present as like hypersexuality and just partying a lot at school because it was the opportunity and motive. But when I started to process it in therapy, it was really hard. That was a really difficult year for me. But when I started to do it, I found that even though I couldn't necessarily get my own kind of closure, I find that I heal through helping others heal as well. So, talking about myself and using that platform to share with others and empower other people who've experienced helps me, especially in a professional capacity now that I have the ability to do that, as well as a personal level. I think talking about it with my friends who have also experienced assault, it's a way to find community with one another. But it definitely has not just been upward since 2016. And, it comes and goes. I experience panic attacks, and I have a hard time feeling safe. Even if I know that I'm physically safe in a space, I'm startled so easily. Like, I'm always checking that I've locked doors, and that's just a response I know I'm going to have for a long time, and that's okay. That's just been my way to healing. But therapy, 100%. When you find a good provider to talk to about it, it's very good. And also just participating in events like this has been very helpful.
I give you a lot of credit because I know you said that it aids in your healing process, but even on a forum like this, sharing so openly is, it's commendable. And I know you said you
Wonderful.
do therapy, yeah. So I know you mentioned that you work in mental health now, and you specifically serve individuals who have been affected by trauma, who are members of the LGBTQ community, who work with addiction. Can you share a little bit about how your experience has affected your work? I know you said that you find giving back to be part of your healing process, but can you share a little bit about how your experience has affected your interpersonal relationships, and as well as your working experience?
I think in regards to my relationships, before, whenever I had partners, it was just, oh, let's use protection. That was kind of it. But now I think it's a more detailed conversation about what I'm comfortable with sexually, what I'm not comfortable with sexually. Um, and I think that provides a safer way, or if I do experience a trigger, um, people don't talk about how you can experience triggers, while you're having sex. That's not talked about. Usually it's talked about, oh, you're by yourself somewhere and you're having a problem. Like, no, it can happen at any time, even with your partner. So it's important to talk about that. And I used to not be able to talk about it with partners, but now I'm able to, and I'm able to identify, hey, I'm triggered by X, Y, or Z. I'm having this response, and this is what I need. I used to not be able to do that, and it's taken a long time. I think my relationships with my best friends have gotten a lot closer because we found community and talking about how they've also experienced sexual assault. It's heartbreaking, but in the end, it's just us supporting each other. In regards to work, it can be a little bit difficult. You find that a lot of people who have substance use disorders, a significant amount also have a mental health. So that's a co-occurring disorder. And then you see that there's trauma underneath there. 50 to 75% of people with a substance use disorder have experienced trauma, and many of which happens to be sexual trauma. And it's about 25% of people with mental health diagnoses. So when you put that together, a lot of people do, and it stems from even childhood, and they don't process it till now. And there's a lot of generational and family trauma. So sometimes I disclose, sometimes I don't. I only disclose if it's helpful to helping somebody heal. Sometimes it's not. But when it is helpful, we find that we really respect each other and we see each other as equals. So it helps them because they know that they have somebody to talk to that knows and understands them, who's not coming from a place of judgment. It's somebody who's there to support them and help them feel safe. It's trauma-informed care.
It's such a beautiful way that you explain trauma-informed care. You could just feel the passion for your work. I know you mentioned that you share it with a lot of your friends, but they have also disclosed that they too are survivors.
Yeah.
Do you feel like since you've become more open about being a survivor yourself, you have more experience with people sharing and opening up to disclose with you?
Yeah, I think definitely as I've gotten older, and sometimes you don't realize that you've experienced a sexual trauma or assault. Like you're like, oh, that's normal. But then when you get older, you look back and you're like, actually, that wasn't okay what happened to me. That was a trauma, and I did experience sexual assault. So I think that in beginning to talk about it, also just societally talking about it more, my friends are like, actually, I did experience sexual assault back then. Neither of us recognized it. And this comes like from having friends for 10 plus years, but also like more recent friends when I talk about it and they're like, oh my God, what a relief. I can talk to you too.
And honestly, it takes a special kind of person, because I feel like a lot of people who work in mental health and specifically in trauma share that sentiment where I don't know what it is, but people just open up to me all the time. But you're giving off that feeling of safety, of security, of people feel like they can trust you. So that's um, it's such a wonderful thing. I know you do it I know you do it as your work, as your job. But to be able to give that off in your personal life too, where people feel comfortable, um, is such a great thing to be able to be there for other people to support them. And I'm so glad it sounds like you have such a healthy support network.
Yeah, it's gotten so much better. So, 8 years ago, I wouldn't have thought that my life would be at this point and that I'd be using something horrible
Mm.
to to help so many other people heal. So it gets better. And if I could write a note to my younger self, I definitely would.
I think our final question for you is, what have you found to be helpful both in the short and long term? And I know you shared a little bit about support from family and friends, support from counseling, reporting. Is there anything, I know you just said, if I could write a letter to my former self, um, what would you say to someone who is newly discovering or newly in the position you were 8 years ago, or newly recognizing that they're in that position? Is there anything you would share that you found to be most helpful?
I think the concept of self-love and self-compassion, um, I mean, because you can love yourself but not be compassionate towards yourself. So learning to be compassionate with yourself is hard, because sometimes you could, experience things from other people, but you can be the meanest person to yourself. So I think trying to look at it is, would you tell a friend that? Would you tell a loved one that? And trying to kind of reframe it and work to love yourself and to give yourself more kindness, because I think a lot of kindness goes a long way in recognizing that you're trying your best. And I also think trying to automatically assume that other people are also trying their best creates a lot more compassion in the world.
I agree. Um, Thank you so much. I'm sure that, well, I'll ask, I know we have an open Q&A at the end, but would you feel comfortable if anyone had questions for you now?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll leave it open just for a moment. If anyone wants to pose a question in the chat or unmute yourself. And if not, we'll move on to our next panelist.
Um, Hi, Jacqueline. I just wanted to thank you for being here and sharing. Everything that you've shared is just incredibly moving, and what you've said about compassion you so clearly demonstrate. So I appreciate you being able to kind of be here to articulate that. I had a question kind of following up with what you said, and later on, if everybody wants to think about what that means to them as well. But we tell people in our roles when receiving a disclosure, not to ask for more information than you need. So as you were describing, not to re-traumatize that person with questions, whether intentionally or not, but what happens when, there are people in this space right now who have jobs that they are the people who need that information, should, a survivor choose to pursue one of the avenues. And so from your perspective, how can those questions be approached in a way that are not re-traumatizing for those people who do, who may need that information to kind of pursue a case in that way?
I think one way is to disclose why you're asking a question before you ask it. And I noticed that Farzana did do that with me. And she was like, I am going to ask you about what you were wearing and what you were drinking. And then she was like, this has no impact as to why your assault happened. This is not your fault. I'm just asking it so I have the full information. So the way she set it off was already a very compassionate way. Like I felt so comfortable answering. I think when you have to describe your assault in detail and all the little things that you try so hard not to remember, I think if you could have like a counselor present or like crisis staff, I think that'd be very helpful because, although yes, I was reporting to Farzana, to my knowledge, like she wasn't like a trained mental health professional. So I think if having the option to at least have somebody present there, like if I could have had my counselor from Rutgers come, or if they could have any counselor available, I think that would be extremely helpful because that can automatically change the whole course of your day.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. And it's really important to think about and a reminder as we try to articulate the importance of trauma-informed care and what that can look like for people. So I appreciate that insight from you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I had a question similar to that. You said that the first person that you disclosed to was your roommate, and I imagine for survivors, it would be someone like a friend or a family member. You said the second person or the second people that you disclosed to were your parents.
Mhm.
And your roommate didn't seem very validating. What do you think could have been like more helpful? Because I think we maybe think that what we would say is helpful, but just coming from you, what would you have liked to hear in that moment that would have made a better impact on your initial disclosure?
I think to first ask what the person needs would be very helpful, just to see if they can do anything. It could be a small thing like drinking water, because drinking water can help you regulate your body when you're experiencing a really tough situation. So it's a really small act, but seeing if they could get anything instead of being like, oh, what about you come drink with us? Like drink in the room. It's like, that's not going to help anything. So I think just first asking what the person needs, and then if they would like to call like emergency services. I think that's a big one. I didn't choose to do that. And then when I did go get tested at the health center, I didn't disclose my assault. I was just like, oh, I had unprotected sex. I think I need to get tested. So I think by doing, asking what the person needs, but also being aware of your emotions, it can be really hard to hear, a loved one say, hey, I've experienced this. But when your emotions kind of overtake the situation, it turns it on the person disclosing to take care of you. And that's not the point of them disclosing. So I experienced that with my parents. And I of course, like they love you so much. My parents like very much wanted to do something, but their reaction was, I'm going to come up there. I'm like, I don't even know who did it. Like, how's that going to help anything? But I know it comes out of love, but trying to not minimize your reaction, but not to let that overshadow what the person is telling you.
Okay, thank you. Also just one more follow-up question. If the person doesn't know what they need, if you say like, hey, what would be most helpful for you right now? And they say, I don't know. Do you have any recommendations to also be there for them when you don't really know how to take that first step?
I think sometimes just being present, even if you're just sitting with them. I think if there's obvious like horrible injuries, encouraging them to let you call emergency services. In my case, like I didn't need like immediate medical attention. It's not like I was like bleeding, or I didn't have anything broken. But if it was something like that, where like you really need to call 911, just encouraging them to do that, or just seeing if there is somebody else that you could contact for them, whether it be like a parent, a partner, whoever.
Okay, thank you.
Jacqueline, thank you so much for being so honest and courageous. And I really appreciate you being here and you sharing your experience with us.
Sure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Jamie, you're up next. So we asked a lot of students what if they could provide some questions for law enforcement in general. And so we have a few that they came up with that I also shared with you. And the first was, can you first explain the process of a case from the time that the survivor comes forward to make a report through the evidence collection process and what that law enforcement investigation looks like?
So similar to what Rachel stated and Jacqueline stated, and Jacqueline, I want to thank you for sharing that with us. We want to make sure that we are not asking questions to be intrusive, but just gathering just the necessary amount of information to decide what the next steps are, whether there's a location, but before we even get there, to assess if there's any medical needs, if there's imminent needs to go to the hospital, if there are additional supportive services, because your health and well-being is first, and then we can always fact find and gather information afterwards. Once we know that's okay, and we're able to gather just the bare details, depending on what happened, the magnitude, the classification of what happened, we may make notifications to the prosecutor's office. And that is just to make sure that if the party chooses to move forward, we want to make sure that we're not asking questions over and over again, and that we're asking strategically and being mindful of them. If it is an act that happened in the near future, we want to tell the party who's reporting, what their rights are. If they choose to have a sexual assault kit, we want to let them know that, to give them that option. And then we'd arrange for services and for them to go and have that kit, have an advocate that's available as well. Now, given the bare minimum information that we gather, sometimes that may not be the most appropriate thing to do. If there's something that's time lapsed a little bit longer and there is not any evidence, then we'd focus on gathering what that information is in general. But the important part of what we definitely want to do either way is make sure that there are some level of supportive services around and offered to the party that's reporting. Sometimes that what happens when you realize sexual assault happens in a case of domestic violence, if it's someone that you're dating, someone that you've lived with, there are additional services that may be provided, and us treating that as a domestic violence act, where we would offer a restraining order, additional supportive services. And that's where trying to pinpoint, asking the right questions and not being intrusive and not trying to re-traumatize someone is really important, because the goal is to make sure that that party has the most options at that time to move forward, whether they choose to move forward at the time they're reporting or a couple of years down the line and they just want to document, but also to make sure that they have all the services available to them that they should have supportively at the time of report.
Thank you. And I know that our UPD, is trained in trauma-informed responses. And so a lot of that goes into what you're explaining about, which Chaplain also touched on, about how to facilitate that disclosure while getting information, but also being sensitive to how that's coming off and not coming off victim blaming, which I know from working with you and with our RUPD does a wonderful job of. One of the questions, what's that?
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I'm turning my radio down.
Oh, one of the questions that came up a lot, and I'm sure you get this often, comes around alcohol and consent and sexual assault. And so the question was, how do cases proceed when both participants were intoxicated and one partner believes that they were too drunk or too intoxicated to consent? And so, that question of, quote, how drunk is too drunk? And so how does RUPD, how does law enforcement respond to that?
Mm-hmm. So one of the things just in general in law enforcement is if you are too intoxicated to give consent, you may be deemed to be mentally incapacitated, meaning that you can't consciously give informed consent to an act. And we take that very seriously, whether it is sexual assault or any other kind of act as well. We want to gather that information. And again, trying to do it in a non-punitive type of situation, whether it is the environment that was around. And I guess it's also, once again, it's sensitive to the time frame that report has actually happened. If it's a closer time frame where that person may need medical attention, then we want to pursue that. If that person is open to pursuing evaluation, because that's always the reporting party's option. Do you want to, are you comfortable at that stage going through having a kit or any other additional testing and reports to figure out what was going on? Then, we'd want to follow that procedure. We definitely want to gather what the information is. If they know the identity of that party, who was around, what exactly happened, to help to try to paint the picture with them. And it takes time, and we have to recognize that it takes time, not only for the person who's reporting, but in just kind of gathering facts, taking time to recall what may have happened, to paint that actual picture. But the main thing that we want people to understand is that if you drink, that doesn't make it your fault, and if you drink to the point where you cannot say yes, and you couldn't say yes, then we have to treat that as a legal issue of someone being mentally incapacitated. And I've seen it. I've seen it working. I've seen it in my life with my friends who are survivors as well, where they've gone through that and there's a question of it. And it just really takes time to try to gather information and paint the picture. It may be a ongoing conversation as things reappear in your mind, or you understand, who may have been around. But it's a process of patience, and it's a process that you really have to allow that person who's reporting to have the option to proceed and to take the time to proceed in the best manner for them.
Thank you. I know that's one of the hardest questions to field when we're doing any training, because it inevitably turns to, well, what happens if we're both drunk, and that whole issue around consent. And so I appreciate you coming from the perspective of law enforcement, because we usually come from, when we talk about consent, and I think a lot of students find it helpful. And I'm sure that when Scott's up, we'll ask a similar question, but that's usually the question that's coming from students.
And we just echo, we'd rather you come and tell us, to give yourself the option, and if you choose to change your mind, you choose to change your mind. But the process is about empowering you to have options that are best for you, in a non-punitive way. If it's just documenting, just so that you have the options to decide what's actually best for you, whether it's in the very moment or later on down the line.
And I so appreciate you using that term options, because we share, when we talk about survivors and we're sharing about the survivor experience, we know that a crime like sexual violence, a survivor had their power taken away. Right? They had their ability to consent, their voice taken away. And so throughout the whole process of disclosure and reporting, having people there who are part of the process, but who also understand giving options. And so, as we always explain to them, you get the choice of, you're in control, you're in the driver's seat. How do you want? You can make a report, you cannot make a report. It's up to you. And so it's comforting to hear that term. I know from so far both of the panelists that that I think that's what survivors need is the understanding that it's okay, whatever you choose to do.
Absolutely.
So in your work with sexual assault survivors, from the lens of law enforcement, and then I guess also from the lens of a SART advocate, because you've been on both sides of it, can you share with us what has been the most challenging for you, and also what's been the most rewarding?
From the lens of law enforcement first, I think the most challenging thing is sometimes when you see someone who has suffered something, and especially when it comes to interpersonal violence, like we want to make sure that there's justice for them. And even in the passion of doing that and wanting to make sure there's justice for them, you have to sometimes take back that that may not be the course or the immediate action for them. And sometimes that can be challenging in wanting something to happen and hearing someone who wants something to happen very immediately. And that may not be the case. I think also sometimes that is challenging with law enforcement, similar to what Jacqueline shared, is I've been in situations where there is that initial consent to someone else. and the feelings or the impressions or relations of that person sometimes affects how that other party is reporting, where they're influencing them. They're possibly trying to coach them, or they feel they're trying to force them to speak, and the party reporting is just not ready, or it's adding additional anxiety to them, it's adding additional more trauma that's necessary in that moment. And that's challenging because you want to play this fine line of, yes, this is someone that is important to that person's life, but in that moment, we need to kind of create some space to figure out, what does this person really want to do? Do they really want to report right now? Are they being pushed to report right now? And that's definitely challenging. What's been, I think, most rewarding has probably been a response to some of the challenges. We've taken an approach when we have the opportunity to provide educational programs to talk about what the reporting process is, talk about the fact that you can complete a kit and it can be held for a certain amount of time. Talk about to our students and to our community members that, you may have someone who comes and tells you a story, they've been sexually assaulted, and this is what the legal definition is. And if this is what the legal definition is, these are what some of the options are. Because oftentimes people will go and report to those people who are close to them, and they may not realize that as well. That form of education is helping to increase the gatekeepers to this process, right? So they can empower and educate when they hear what's going on. That's been very beneficial. We have had a long-going physical self-defense program. We first started with RAD several years ago, and we've kind of morphed into kind of creating a general self-defense and situational awareness program with a specific instructor. Years ago, when I was an instructor for that program, I've had a number of different survivors. And I saw people who went through a process where they were trying to find their power, in their own words, saying, I'm trying to get my power back. I'm trying to feel comfortable again. And having a conversation of, listen, we want you to feel confident, not just through physical tactics or physical empowerment, but we want you to feel confident in helping you navigate your everyday life. How can we help you develop tips and tools where it makes you feel more comfortable? It makes you feel more empowered and assertive, and that there's nothing wrong with feeling that way if that's what's going to help you in that moment. So I volunteered for about 5 years as a sexual assault advocate when I was a police officer, right before I became a sergeant. And the program was actually a connection that was off through Rutgers University, Newark, for the county. And my inspiration for doing that was because I knew friends who were sexually assaulted. And I remember one of my first friends who told me that she was assaulted. I was a police officer. Her brother was a police officer. And typical to, I'm not sure if Jacqueline stated that or Jay, they're like, well, why didn't you say anything? And she's like, just because of that reaction, because you guys looked at me now, like, you got to go get them. So in realizing what that reaction was for her and seeing that opportunity, and then also understanding what my role was as a police officer, I looked at it as an opportunity to kind of give back and balance and also learn from a different perspective. What was challenging for me, my most challenging time as an advocate, to be honest, and sometimes feeling helpless, is being at the hospital with those who suffered a trauma. And oftentimes we were charged to try to figure out what's the next step for them. And I can recall a couple of different times where there were either people who were under the age of 18 and they were afraid to contact a parent, or afraid of what the repercussions were, without going into specific details. And there are other people who their families just weren't going to come. And that's a really hard thing to process, because you want to have them, you want them to have support. They've gone through making a police report, they've gone through an examination, they've been given the follow-up information, they've been given counseling information. Now it's, what's the next step? And it's not fair for you to think that you walk out the door, and because you walk out the hospital, everything's okay. But to think that there are some people that reached out for support and they didn't receive it, that was probably the most challenging. Some of the most rewarding aspects during that experience for me is probably, the times where getting a call at 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning where someone just needs to vent, because I tended to do overnight hours because of what my work schedule was. And they felt better after venting, whether it was a survivor or a family member. Those were rewarding. And letting them know that somebody does, is there and wants to hear and listen. It does care, it doesn't matter what time of day or night it is. That probably is one of the most rewarding aspects for me.
I appreciate so much that you shared that. I've spent the better part of 15 years on and off of whether it's DV or SA hotlines. So I can relate to that feeling of you see your phone at 1 a.m. and you're like, oh, I just want to sleep. But then you take the call and you feel so much better because you know how much you've helped that person on the other end of the line, that if they're reaching out at 1 o'clock in the morning to you, they must not have other people that they can rely on for support. And so to be able to be there for them when they need it is such a rewarding feeling.
Absolutely.
And I think the last question was just from your various perspectives, as a friend who you stated has had, many people in your life disclose, as a member of law enforcement doing the work that you do, especially on a college campus where you see this type of this type of assault happen, and especially because we're such a small campus, and then through your work as an advocate, what's something that you would like for survivors to know, or what's something that you would like to share with survivors?
I think the main thing is that there are people who are willing and want to listen. And that's the most important thing, just from looking at with that lens, is that there are people who just are willing to listen. And sometimes you just need to, in your own time, your own pace, be able to speak without what no one worrying about what the next steps are. And fortunately, with some of the changes in laws in this state compared to some other states, there's time. There's not necessarily the biggest rush outside of evidence collection, depending what the time frame is. And even there are options with the evidence collection, depending on what the circumstances of the case are, for you to decide what happens. So just the idea of there's somebody who's going to listen, whether it's an advocate, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's a counselor, to know that. And that's important, and that's power as well, for you to feel like your voice is heard in whatever context that you want to have it heard, and at whatever pace you want to have it heard.
I appreciate that so much. Does anyone have any questions specifically for Lieutenant Hendricks? You can feel free to put it in the chat or unmute yourself and ask. I'll leave a moment for that.
Hi, I do have a question. So thank you so much for being here and sharing. And I actually have a question for Jamie and Jacqueline. But so I know there's a lot of mental health effects that survivors go through. And so my question was, what can be done to further the visibility of recovery resources on campus and help victims who are experiencing mental health effects?
I'm not sure, Christy, if there's someone else who's here wants to jump in on that as well, or.
Yeah, are you wondering specifically about visibility in terms of more presence on campus to support, like clinicians, or visibility of services, accessibility?
Yeah, so I'm thinking I guess both, because I feel like with both Jamie and Jacqueline, a big thing was a lot of the times the support that was given initially wasn't what they needed at the time. And so I feel like there needs to be better support on campus. So I guess it's like a more general question.
Yeah, I mean, I can't say that I disagree at all. And I think that's a large part of what our office is tasked with, which is trying to educate our campus, not just the students, but the staff, the faculty, everyone on campus, on simple things. We have a whole training on how to handle a disclosure. We have a toolkit that went out this month to staff, faculty, and students on, there's a one-page document on really, really brief ways to support a student through a disclosure, to support anybody through a disclosure. And, it really shouldn't be limited just to Rutgers University. It's to learn those skills to be able to support those in your life who do identify as survivors and may disclose. But I think it starts with being in those spaces, whether it's physical, virtual, small groups, big groups, putting we've put slides together to provide faculty members to say, hey, could you add this? Could you keep this on hand? We have Scott's office and our office have a brief one flip side postcard that we sent out to every faculty member on campus, every staff member on campus with information, brief information. I think it really goes back to educating on how to handle a disclosure, because I certainly don't expect everybody to know everything. I mean, we collectively in this space don't even know everything, and this is what we do. I don't pretend to be an expert on everything related to interpersonal violence, because there's always more to learn. But I think if we can equip our campus community, everyone within our campus community, to learn a little bit about how to support, or even just, I may not know of exactly how to handle this situation, but I know what not to do. And I know of a resource you can go to. I'll take that, right? Because I think it's better to not receive the disclosure poorly than to handle it perfectly. Because there are some just huge no-nos. And there's obviously perfect ways to handle a disclosure, but we don't expect everybody to do that. So I think, unless someone else wants to hop in with their thoughts, I think really it's a matter of us continuing to do our work to make sure that we're canvassing our campus, and we're not stopping until we provide literature or provide a training or information to everyone on our campus on, here's how to handle a disclosure, here's our office, here's what we do, here's how to support a survivor. Use us, reach out to us. And if you know of a survivor who needs support, we're completely confidential, right? Refer the survivor to us, refer the ally to us, and we can support them, and we don't have to report that information.
Yeah, I just definitely would echo what Christy stated. Probably first, as students, I would like to think maybe all of us, if there's a way that you feel like is most effective to communicate, let us know. We're all ears, because we can understand there are different challenges in communicating with a diverse student population, not just through ethnicity, but through people who are full-time, part-time, parents. There's so many different ways that people engage and receive information. So we're always open to educating, especially when it comes to educating people who, again, you could be the gatekeepers of this process. When I've more so done workshops with staff regarding interpersonal violence and law enforcement and what happens, one of the things I tell them is, before you react, ask. Like, if it's not happening right now, where there's not this imminent threat and you don't know what's going on, just stop and ask. And I think that translates over to all the other services, whether it's Scott's office, Chrissy's office, my office. There's not a threat, just stop and respectfully, I just need a second, and make a phone call. We've done that with staff for things that are off campus and people have heard things. And it's, I have a friend who's doing this, I have a friend who's doing that. And somebody just makes a phone call, and we can say, well, legally, what you're saying as a third party option, these are some of the things that may happen. This person should call this department or X, Y, and Z. And that's one of the options. We've also done that with our campus partners as well. And what I found with that is, even when we have a student who may be a victim, having that appropriate information, that correct information, allows them to make a decision, versus someone telling them something that it may be potentially inaccurate or damaging to them. It takes them steps back where they don't need to be.
Definitely echo everything that Jamie and Christy just said. I will say that the VPVA was not a thing when I was assaulted. I was in undergrad from 2013 to 2017. And then I did some graduate work for a couple years after that. But I would say that when I was doing my graduate work was when the came about. And I wish I would have had something like that. I wish I would have had a peer support line. And I think that's a big start. But I actually spoke with Farzana way before I ever intended on reporting, because I didn't agree with the sign that was up on campus during April. I don't know if they still do that. They put a lot of like flyers around campus, but they had like little yard signs all over the Paul Robeson Center, like in the grass outside, and it said yes means yes. And I walked in and I was like, no, it doesn't, Farzana. I was just like, hi, nice to meet you. But no, it doesn't. I was just like, you can be coerced into saying yes. Like, I was so upset about it. And she was like, I hear what you're saying. And she was like, but it got you in here. And I was like, okay, you're right. But I didn't agree with what she said. I was just I was actually upset about what I saw, but that's what got me in the office. So I already kind of established a relationship with her, and it did get me thinking. But I think during orientation, there was a sexual assault. I guess, I don't know the word for it, like not a class, but just for you to sit and be educated on it. Too easy to skip. Like, I didn't go because I was tired, but like a ton of people are like, oh, I'm not going to that, it doesn't matter. I'm like, that should be mandatory, I think, for people coming into school. I think making sure clinicians are very trauma informed at the counseling center, and also having like trauma informed staff. That's a big one. But utilizing peers is super powerful. They've researched the concept of like peer support since the 90s, and it incredibly helps, like more so than like medications can do. So I think having these services is a really good way, but also talking about it with, it's not something to keep secret. It's okay to talk about it. That kind of rhetoric is important.
Thank you, Jacqueline. Apurva, I'm not sure if we answered your question adequately, but I will say that, there's so much work to be done. And Jacqueline, you're correct. We came here in 2018. So we were probably here during your grad school tenure, but we were not here when you were an undergrad. And you're correct about using peers. But, to properly train our entire campus community in trauma-informed care is probably not very feasible. But we're new, right? I mean, we've only been here since 2018, and we have a lot of work ahead of us, and we have so many new things being planned, and all of that surrounds how can we best get in front of our students? How can we make the campus safer, and not just physically safer, but emotionally safer? Because I'm a strong believer in emotional safety is just as important as physical safety. And how can we have faculty and staff who are welcoming to receive a disclosure and understand how to support all students, and maybe more importantly, have students that understand how to support our students. So thank you for that question. Any other questions for Jamie?
This was a comment to what you were saying, Christy. I think another thing that we could do is also train people like faculty or like coaches who are interacting with students the most to be brave enough to ask, like, hey, I've noticed like you're a little more quiet in class, or you're kind of like ducking out like really quickly when you usually stay behind. Like, is everything okay? Because a person is not always gonna feel safe talking to you or think that you even care. But I think that you, as like a person who could be disclosed to, just even taking that step and say like, oh, like if anything's up, like you don't have to talk about it now, but if anything's happened, my door is always open. I think that even just opening the door and starting the conversation takes a lot of pressure on people, a lot of pressure off people, and could be more beneficial, especially if they've had like bad experiences with disclosure. Even if I think like that's also important as well. And yeah, that was just like my opinion.
No, and you know what? It's a great point, because a lot of people don't feel comfortable opening that door themselves to ask for help. But if someone opens it for them, even if it's a crack, to say, hey, are you okay? That's an open door. And so a lot of that goes back to destigmatizing mental health in general, destigmatizing being a survivor and what that looks like, and opening up conversations. I don't want to say normalizing violence, because we certainly don't want to do that, but making it okay to share experiences, making it less scary to be able to disclose by making the campus feel safer. So yeah, I completely agree, and thank you. Scott, I believe our next questions are for you. So Scott, you are the Director of Title IX and ADA on our campus. And with that said, I don't think many people even know what Title IX is. So I think a lot of people associate it with, NCAA college athletics. So before we share a little bit about, before we pose the other questions, can you maybe give a little bit of an explanation as to what Title IX is, what students need to know about Title IX, and how it relates to interpersonal violence on campus?
Absolutely. So Title IX is a federal law. It's part of the Education Amendments Act of 1972. And it states that no person on the basis of sex shall be discriminated against, denied access to, or excluded from any program or institution that receives federal funding. Under Title IX, there are provisions that state any institution or entity or program that receives federal funding must comply with Title IX and must respond to complaints of interpersonal violence. Prior to 2008, as you said, Christy, people associated Title IX with equity and equality and intercollegiate sports as it relates to gender. In 2008, that changed during President Obama's administration and, the Vice President Joe Biden's efforts or major campaign. It's on us with respect to addressing interpersonal violence. So, again, under Title IX, there's a provision that states that complaints of interpersonal violence have to be addressed on college and university campuses.
Thank you. So can you explain a little bit about what the process is within Title IX for a survivor who comes forward to make a report about an act of sexual harassment or sexual misconduct that occurred to them? And I know a lot of the questions that we get from students are, what's the distinction between law enforcement, making a report to law enforcement, or making a report to Title IX? Are they the same? What does that distinction look like?
Absolutely. So they are totally different. Title IX is the university's administrative process. When you report to RUPD, that's a criminal process. We both operate differently with respect to investigations. My investigation, or the Title IX investigation, is based on a preponderance of evidence. What that means is it more likely than not to have occurred? With regards to the criminal side, it's clear and convincing evidence, preponderance, clear and convincing with respect to the burden of proof. So when an individual comes in and reports an incident that may fall under Title IX, what I do is I first review what's communicated, and then I look at what's communicated and say, okay, if this occurred, would it violate the university's Title IX policy? And if it does, then what happens is that complaint is then taken and it's forwarded to the Title IX investigator. The Title IX investigator reviews the complaint and then will reach out to the complainant and call the complainant in for an interview and get all the pertinent information that's needed. When I say pertinent information, I mean the who, the what, the when, and where the alleged incident occurred. Take any information down with regards to any potential witnesses, interview any witnesses, and then lastly, interview the respondent and get any information that the respondent might have, whether it be any witnesses on the respondent's behalf. And the Title IX investigator would then interview those individuals. Once all this information is gathered, the Title IX investigator then composes an investigative report. That investigative report, encompasses all the information that was gathered as part of the investigation. And then that's forwarded to me as the Title IX coordinator. I then look at the investigative report and then decide, based on the information, is it more likely than not that this incident occurred? And once I make that determination, let's say if there is a finding that the investigation revealed information to support the allegations, is then forwarded to the conduct office for disciplinary action. In cases where there is no finding, I'm then tasked with calling the complainant and communicating to them that, what the investigation was unable to find enough information to support the allegation, and not saying that not saying it didn't occur, but the investigation was unable to find enough information to support. You know, in most situations, you know, it's two parties assertions and, you know, trying to determine what happened and during the particular incident can be difficult. And so that's why we try to gather as much information. And so some of the questions may appear to be intrusive, but it's an attempt to, you know, get all the pertinent facts, specifically like when alcohol is involved, you know, how many drinks, what were you drinking, when were you drinking, you know, to establish, you know, whether the person or individuals were in the position to give consent. So.
And I imagine for you being in that situation, having to provide an answer, so to speak, to a student, is
Absolutely.
a difficult position to be in. Because I get that question from students a lot, like, well, why would I report what happens if I report and I don't get the answer that I want?
Mhm.
You know, what then?
Yeah.
And so, and I know even with law enforcement cases or with Title IX cases, it doesn't always work out to be in favor of the survivor. And so I imagine that that's difficult because obviously I understand the Title IX system, but also to say that, you know, it, as you mentioned, it's not that we're saying we don't believe you.
Mhm.
But I can understand how students might feel like you're giving me an answer that doesn't support me and it feels like you don't believe
Don't
me.
believe me, absolutely.
Right.
And that's one of the most challenging things with respect to, you know, the Title IX investigations. Like I said, we're not communicating that this didn't occur. We're not communicating that it didn't occur the way you said it occurred. But, you know, what we are communicating is that the investigation didn't find enough information to support that.
One of the questions was, can a student receive accommodations from Rutgers if they've been the victim of a crime or an act of interpersonal violence, but they don't want to report to Title IX or to RUPD?
Absolutely. You know, we call them supportive measures or interim measures with respect to incidents, you know, and that could include changing class schedule, changing residence halls, you know, at providing, let's say, security in terms of walking to class, walking, you know, from the library during late hours, anything to make the student feel more comfortable. What we cannot do is take action against the respondent or the accused. You know, all the interim measures that we take or the supportive measures that we take have to be towards the complainant. And that's with respect to, you know, not taking action against someone without due process. When I say due process, without an investigation taking place to determine whether there was, you know, enough information to support the allegation that's being made.
And so if students were interested in obtaining those interim measures, but did not feel ready or comfortable at this time to move forward with making a complaint, what steps would they follow to obtain interim measures?
The same process in terms of filing a complaint. Reach out to my office, whether it be through the Title IX email or whether it be, you know, through my phone number, and communicate to me like, you know, there's an incident. I'm not, you know, comfortable right now with reporting, but, you know, I want to know if it's possible. Let's say I could move my room, change to a different dorm, or I want to know if it's possible I could move to a different section of a course, you know, and we'll do our best to make that happen.
And the final question was, what type of amnesty does Rutgers offer to students, or what does it look like for a student who may want to make a report to Title IX, either with regards to themselves as the complainant or the victim survivor, or regarding someone else as the complainant or the victim or survivor, but they themselves may have done something that violated the code of conduct, whether it's in relation to substance use or something else that violates the code of conduct. Is there any type of student amnesty? Should they feel comfortable coming forward? What can they expect?
Absolutely. I mean, they should feel comfortable coming forward to court. There is amnesty with respect to drug and alcohol use in relation to an incident. However, there is no amnesty if drugs and alcohol are intentionally used to put a person in a incapacitated state to whereas they can't consent. So if, drugs and alcohol are being used and or consumed and an incident happens, a student should feel comfortable reporting because under the policy, no disciplinary action would be taken, with respect to usage again, but only if, drugs and alcohol aren't intentionally being used to put a person in an incapacitated
Right.
state.
And I do appreciate that you made that distinction. And so to be clear, because I know we'll share this on various platforms, so we're hoping that we'll have a lot of students viewing this. To be clear, if a student is under the influence of substances and witness or experience an act of interpersonal violence, they can feel comfortable calling the RA on duty or another member of faculty or staff and reporting that, and will not get in trouble for being under the influence or in the possession of.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Is there anything that you would like to share? I know I've been asking that question of our panelists, but I've worked with you for some time and I can, I know that Title IX gets a bad rep, right?
Absolutely.
It does. But, and I know a lot of schools are surprised when they find out that our VPVA, our Victim Services Support Program, works closely with Title IX because they say, well, isn't that kind of a, aren't you at odds? And so is there anything that you, from your perspective or from your lens, that you'd like to share with students or you think is important for students to know?
I think the student should recognize that they have options. It's totally up to them whether they want to file a complaint or not. That not necessarily think about the outcome, but with respect to reporting incidents, it's from what's been communicated to me, it could be somewhat empowering, reporting the incident and, making someone aware so that this individual or the accused doesn't necessarily, I don't want to say go unpunished, but, with respect to reporting that, making it clear or understanding that what was allegedly done wasn't okay. And so I do understand with respect the difficulty that comes with the possibility of knowing that, hey, it's a chance that there may be no evidence to support my allegation. I totally understand that. And I think to some extent that could be chilling, but I do say report it. I strongly encourage reporting, whether it be to Title IX or whether it be to VPVA. And if you're not sure, talk to a confidential resource first, talk it out and decide what you feel is in your best interest in terms of moving forward and your personal healing process.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for sharing your own views and then for sharing some information for our students to hopefully make our students feel more comfortable. And I think too, seeing someone, recognizing a name, recognizing a face, so it's not just an office on a piece of paper that can be scary, but recognizing people that they know and feel comfortable with. So I appreciate that. I'll open it up if anyone has questions for Scott, either in the chat or if you feel comfortable unmuting yourself. If you have a question, I'll give a moment.
I actually have a question, if that's okay. Scott, what are some ways that you find that there's limitations in trying to investigate cases that are reported later, like, 6+ months
Yeah.
after an assault happens?
Well, with respect to my respect to Title IX, it's different, because again, I'm not going based on, let's say, criminal evidence. I'm taking witness statements and going from then. And so with regards to time frame, I think the most challenging aspect with that is the recollection of what occurred, how things occurred. And so as time goes by, some details are forgotten. And so, but in some cases, individuals remember it just like it was yesterday. So I think there isn't a significant issue with respect to time frame as far as the Title IX process is concerned.
Actually, Christy, I have a question too for Scott's. What is the policy or procedure for providing a victim statement to a defense attorney in a criminal prosecution? Is it discoverable at all? Is there confidentiality? How does that work?
Well, you're saying a criminal defense attorney. That would be
Or a prosecutor, whatever.
Yeah, that information would have to be subpoenaed from us. That's not something we just openly share. Both the respondent and complainant do get a copy of the investigative report. So what's been communicated by on all parties, whether it be witnesses, complainants, is communicated in the investigative report, and the respondent receives a copy of the investigative report at the end of the process. So, that's when they would become privy of that information. But let's say outside law enforcement would have to subpoena that information from us.
Okay.
Any other questions for Scott? Okay. Thank you, Scott. I appreciate you. All right, Lori. So in your work with sexual assault survivors, I know in your bio we shared that you've worked with sexual assault survivors in the capacity of a prosecutor working sex crime cases for 30 years. So in your experience working with sexual assault survivors, what can you share with us that has been one of the most challenging aspects of your job?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me tonight. I appreciate that. In thinking back over the years, I think the most challenging part of these cases has really been to try and keep a victim from being discouraged about what is inevitable about the court process. And that is that it's never quick. It's never a quick process. I think people are somewhat distracted by television, and they think things are going to go quickly because of TV and how things are solved so easily on TV. But the court process is all about taking its time and being slow and delays. From the prosecutor's perspective, if a case involves any kind of computer or digital evidence, that can automatically mean a delay of anywhere from 3 to 4 months until a forensic exam can be done to retrieve that evidence. And that's because there's so many cases now, all different kinds of cases that have this kind of evidence. So very few law enforcement officers that are properly trained to retrieve it. One of the more common reasons for delay is that defense attorneys tend to file a lot of motions before trial, evidential motions to see what can and what can't be admitted into the trial before the jury. Some of these motions are reasonable, they're foreseeable, and they're valid, but by the same token, some aren't. The bottom line is they all have to be litigated. They all have to be briefed and argued before the trial judge, and that takes time. Trials can also be delayed by witness availability, judge availability, court availability. There's just so many cases in the system, not just sex crimes cases, but all different kinds of cases, and just too few judges to handle them. And this past year, I think, has complicated things so much more because of the pandemic, because no trials have been heard throughout the state for well over a year. And it's created more of a backlog in the system than there ever was before. I know that, like that's a very difficult thing for survivors to process and understand. And some people do feel like it's a personal affront. So the challenge for me was always to keep them from getting discouraged and not, giving up on the prosecution, which in the end is a benefit to the defendant and frankly, what they hope for. They want you to give up. So for me, the most challenging thing is to keep them from getting discouraged. And you do that, I think, by communication, constant communication, taking those calls, talking to people, meeting with them if and when they want to meet. Some people don't want to see you before the trial for very long periods of time. They're fine with that. But for those people that want that, you have to give that to them because you want to keep that connection. You want to keep that interest. So that I find to be, I've always found that to be the most difficult thing.
We hear a lot, and I know you mentioned that TV has really swayed what the expectations are from everything. I think from evidence collection, from how swiftly things will happen, from what an interrogation looks like, just the CSI effect, right?
Yep.
But in your experience in taking cases that are specific to sex crimes, we hear a lot about getting a quote unquote rape kit, right? An evidence collection kit. And for those of us in this room who aren't familiar with that, there's a 5-day window in which someone can get an evidence collection kit from the time that they're sexually assaulted. They can go to a hospital that has a forensic nurse examiner that specializes in forensic evidence collection and get these kits done. But that's a 5-day window. And so we know a lot of survivors don't get that. And so at least from my perspective, I hear a lot of survivors saying, I'm afraid to come forward because I don't have any evidence. And so no one will believe me. Will it even go to trial? And so one of the questions from a student was, if I don't have physical evidence, how likely is it, or if I'm coming 10 years later, how likely is it that my case will even go to trial? How does that even look if I wanted to come forward and report? Or if there was a trial, what would that look like?
Well, in terms of how we work with those kinds of situations and cases, you have to take a victim's statement and search for corroboration. I mean, there's always something. And you look at, and this is more, I think, the law enforcement issue too, you look at a victim's statement and you just follow the trail, follow where it leads, and look for perhaps like it's a party and there's people who were there beforehand that saw both the defendant and the victim at this particular party, or somebody who saw them afterwards, somebody who could give you a timeline, anybody that they spoke to and confided in over that period of time. The law provides that there's no limit to how many people I can bring in to the trial to testify as to what the victim told them about the offense, the allegation itself. So you try and get as much as conceivably possible in terms of corroboration to make it the best circumstance possible for trial. I think you're on mute, Christy.
Not like the statement of 2020 and 2021.
No.
So we're talking about trials. And I know you shared in your first statement that you want to support a survivor and not discourage them and not have them feel discouraged to come forward to continue the process, even though it can be really lengthy. So during that pretrial period and during that trial period, if a case gets to that point, how do you support it? How do you support a survivor during that period? So the way that the student had phrased the question was, how do you support a survivor during the pretrial and trial process when the defense places blame on the survivor, minimizes the defendant's intentions, or implies consent?
Well, in thinking about this, I approach it from my own way of dealing with people in general, which is pretty much a truth teller. And I try to lay it all out and be honest with people, because I don't think there's any real merit to beating around the bush with anybody. So I think prosecutors, from my point of view, need to emphasize to victims that there are very few defenses in these kinds of cases. So something like casting blame on the victim, or a defendant minimizing his or her actions, or arguing consent, is literally going to be in almost every case that we do. I mean, it just is. And it's the defense attorney's job to use those defenses. So having a victim understand that and understand that as a basic fact of life, so to speak, in these cases, I think is really important. The other thing is that another thing is that I think prosecutors need to do a mock cross-examination with the victim to prepare them for trial, just to prepare them for the kinds of questions that they're going to encounter when they're on the witness stand. Some prosecutors are just not comfortable with that role, or they don't want to upset a victim before trial. But I've always felt that being prepared, giving a victim the ammunition to steel themselves for that, I think is really important, and probably one of the best kinds of support that you can give them. Another thing I think is to talk with a victim about the things or the kinds of information about their case that is positive and that counterbalances all of those arguments, so that they understand what is the good in their case, what is supportive of their position, so that they can feel better about getting up there and talking about it. And most importantly, and I sort of think this is basic, but I'm kind of surprised all the time at how some people don't get this, but I think a lot of prosecutors will go a long way in supporting victims if they communicate their belief in the victim at every turn, no matter what. A victim needs to know that this person who is going to be, in effect, their lawyer in court believes them no matter what. And I think communicating that to people is so, so important, and the basis literally for everything else.
When we do prevention education, or we talked earlier about all the efforts we make on campus to do trauma-informed care or to educate staff, faculty, and students, that is the number one thing on every PowerPoint, on every slide, on every social media graphic, and every interaction is believe them.
Mm-hmm.
Because hearing from someone else, I believe you, empowers the survivor to feel okay, even if those people don't, you do, somebody does. And we spoke a little bit earlier about that disclosure process, and a lot of times survivors disclosed and it was poorly handled. And so maybe they didn't come forward for years. And so I really appreciate that as a prosecutor, you really implore your belief in and let let that survivor know that you believe them, because I feel like that goes a long way in their comfort and their trust in you.
Well, especially when you're in the courtroom, it can almost seem to many survivors that there is this wall of people who they have to sort of get through in order to get their story out. And you want to give them at least one face that they know, they're comfortable with, and they know believes them. And that, I think, is so important.
Another one of the questions surrounds cross-examination. And so again, this might be a little bit of the CSI effect, but you know, we hear about how a survivor would get put on the stand and be cross-examined by the defense attorney. And a lot of times is ask questions about, you know, victim blaming questions about what they were wearing and trying to either make them misstep or make them seem responsible in some aspect. And now with social media coming into play a lot, one of the questions was, what can be brought up during cross-examination? What's not allowed? What is allowed? And can social media history be brought up? Can the way that someone is dressed or sexual past, sexual history, what's allowed to be brought up and essentially be held against a survivor?
Yeah, I in looking at this question, I wanted to just take these like one at a time. And the easiest thing, so to speak, is social media. Social media, honestly, is fair game. If it's out there, it's in public, it's fodder for cross-examination. And that's really the issue for everybody, you know, no matter what no matter who you are, what you're doing, you kind of have to be very careful of what you post online, because it can affect anything, your job possibilities, school possibilities, everything. And, you know, court case is no different. So if it's out there, it is fair game. Now, the defendant may not have direct access to your account, but look at the statistics. The statistics tell you that the odds are that this person who sexually assaulted you is somebody that you know, or somebody that is an acquaintance, or somebody that is within your social circle or one of your social circles. So the odds are pretty good that even if he or she is not a, I hate to use Facebook because that gives away my age, but the bottom line is, even if they're not directly having access to your account, they may know somebody who has direct access to your account, and that may be sharing something that you've posted, or will share that information with the defendant. I've seen that happen more than once, believe it or not, where somebody did not expect that a friend of theirs would actually share that information with the defendant. So everybody should be very wary of putting things on social media, no matter what. There was a question about a profession or job, whether that's relevant. And I think this would be dependent upon the circumstances of the case and the nature of what you do for a living. Let's say, for example, if the victim is a lawyer, a defendant could potentially use that to suggest that perhaps allegations were made as a form of revenge, let's say, knowing full well that the consequences of a sexual assault allegation are pretty damning and pretty harsh. If you were a garbage collector, well, then it might make it very difficult to make that kind of an argument, or any kind of an argument, to justify admitting it. So the short answer is, it really is dependent upon that. A victim's criminal history. Well, in terms of criminal history, people need to understand that the courts are typically only concerned with convictions for crimes, not disorderly persons offenses like a simple assault or harassment, and not municipal ordinances of any kind, just convictions for crimes. Having said that, The law is pretty strict when it comes to deciding how and if the past criminal convictions of a defendant are brought into the jury's attention. Not so much with witnesses and victims. It is much more lenient in terms of whether it's admissible before a jury. Though generally speaking, any conviction for a crime over 10 years old will likely not come in unless it's a very, very serious crime. The court is going to look at whether or not the prejudice to the witness in admitting that evidence of the prior conviction is outweighed by its relevance to whatever issue it is intended to go towards. But many times, I have to be honest, a recent conviction for a crime for a witness or a victim will likely be admissible. With respect to sexual history, this is a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to try to weed out the legalese for everybody and just do it straight. We have a statute in the state of New Jersey called the Rape Shield Statute, and it governs if and when sexual history is admissible in trial. The idea behind the statute is to balance the rights of privacy of the victim with the defendant's right to confront witnesses or to cross-examine witnesses under the Sixth Amendment. The statute divides the victim's prior sexual conduct into two categories. One is the victim's prior sexual conduct with the defendant who's on trial. And the second category is the prior sexual conduct of the victim with someone else. Prior sexual conduct with somebody other than the defendant on trial is pretty limited and is only admissible if it was material to proving the source of semen, source of pregnancy, or the source of disease, okay? The prior sexual conduct with the defendant who is on trial is admissible if it goes to whether or not the defendant reasonably believes the victim gave consent to the sexual act. So it really goes to the issue of consent. Now, the statute defines sexual conduct pretty broadly. It's any conduct or behavior relating to sexual activities of a victim, which include but are not limited to previous or subsequent sexual penetration or sexual contact, use of contraceptives, sexual activities that may be in gynecological records, living arrangements, or lifestyle. I would also add that evidence of a victim's sexual conduct that is more than a year before the date of the offense is presumed to be inadmissible. Now, this is just a presumption. The presumption can be rebutted if the if the court finds that the defense reason for wanting it in trial overcomes that presumption. You also mentioned evidence of the manner of dress. Under the statute, evidence of the victim's manner of dress is not admissible, sorry about the telephone, unless the court makes a specific finding determining it to be relevant for very specific reasons. So the bottom line with sexual history is that all of the evidence sought under the Rape Shield Statute is probably one of the most litigated areas in the sex crimes cases. And for the most part, I would say that the case law favors the victim. It's going to be very dependent upon the circumstances when it comes to the consent issue, but for the most part, I think it's very favorable.
Thank you for sharing all that. I know that there's a lot of technicalities that are involved in there, but I really appreciate such a thorough answer because I think, again, we're looking at this from the perspective of a survivor, and every single one of our panelists tonight were chosen because of what your either professional or personal history is, the profession that you represent, and as it relates to a survivor, because survivors are afraid to come forward. Because I mean, thinking of a survivor hearing everything that you just explained, that's overwhelming to a layperson, right? And I'm sure that you explain it differently when you're explaining it to a survivor, and to families, but to feel like I don't understand the system, to feel like I might be outnumbered in the courtroom, to feel like I have to face my abuser, are all so fear inspiring. So I guess my final question for you, a two-parted question, was, I know you're no longer in that field. I asked you what your challenges were. I'll ask what you found the most rewarding, but also what do you miss from doing that work? Because it's heavy, heavy work. It
Oh
really
my
is.
gosh. Yeah, it is, but I have to say that, oh my gosh, I kind of didn't expect that. I miss everything. I do. And sometimes I sit back and I kind of regret what I did. But there comes a time, sometimes you have to move on. But the most rewarding thing, I think, has been when I've seen over the years a victim gets such a sense of empowerment simply by just confronting a defendant, simply taking control and taking their power back, not letting a defense attorney bully them or wear them down, not letting the sight of the defendant in a courtroom intimidate them. And I've seen it change attitudes, change demeanor. I can picture in my head two young girls, sisters, who had been sexually assaulted by their stepfather. When I first met them, everything about their appearance was, they looked like rag dolls to me. I mean, it was just, they looked like they didn't care about their personal appearances. And here we're talking about teenage girls who usually care very much for their appearance. And it was just so incredible to watch the change in them, in their appearance over time as they got more confident. They felt better. They felt like somebody believed them, even though their own mother didn't. We wound up getting a guilty verdict in that particular case, but they looked and felt so much more empowered before that even happened. And that just, it just made me so incredibly happy to see that change in them. So that, to me, is probably the most rewarding thing when I see that. We can't, in this business, we can't control the outcome. We have no control over it. We can only do the best we can do. And then once it goes to the jury, it's pretty much out of our control. So I never tell anybody, or I've never told anybody, you'll feel better if once this is over and you've got a guilty verdict, or this is a slam dunk. I've never used any of that language, because the victory is really in coming forward, and saying something to somebody. I mean, this person has so much power just by your silence, and keeping silent. You're cooperating with giving him that power. You're enabling him to have power over you. So telling somebody about it, even if it's not a prosecutor, even if it's your therapist or your sister, your girlfriend, that takes some of that power away. And that, I think, is the most important thing. Done.
I love that you chose to end on that. Because I think so often people feel so silenced if that first disclosure doesn't go well, if someone doesn't believe them, or they don't have a support network, especially if they were children when it happened and they told. And we know that the cycle of violence perpetuates. And so often we see someone who experienced sexual abuse or lived in a household where there was domestic violence as a child, they wind up in an unhealthy, abusive relationship where they experience sexual violence. They experience sexual violence in a multitude of different capacities. And so they don't tell anyone. I had a survivor who was 68 years old the first time that they disclosed. And they said, I disclosed once when I was 5. And my mom told me it was a bad dream and to go back to bed. And months later married the man that had assaulted me. And she said, I never said a word. I never said a word. And this woman had, I mean, when you talk about complex trauma, and she was 68 years old. And she came in the following session and said, I cried for about 7 days straight after I said it out loud. But she said, I feel like a 100-pound ton has been lifted off my chest. And she said, I can't believe I waited 63 years to say something again. And so, yeah, whenever the survivor decides is the right time and to whom is completely their decision. But, I very much agree with that sentiment that secrecy only supports the perpetrator. Thank you. I'll open it up. Does anyone have any questions for Lori? Nothing. So I just want to open it up then to general questions. I want to be mindful of time. We have a few minutes left, but I know that we shared some really heavy comments tonight, and we spoke about the journey of a survivor. We talked about opening up about trauma. We talked about Title IX. We talked about law enforcement. We talked about the legal system and trials and what that looks like and what that feels like and what that means. And so just in the interest of it being, just in the interest of it being a safe space, does anyone have any overall questions that they'd like to direct to either one of the panelists or to myself, or any comments that they'd like to share?
Hi again. I wanted to thank everyone for participating. This was such a great experience to be a part of and to hear all of your insights and perspectives. I know this is kind of going to be a big question. We only have a couple of minutes, and it's kind of for anyone who would like to respond to it, because I think all of our panelists have touched on this, and it's something that I have personally struggled with in the work. So I'm just kind of interested to hear if anybody wants to share. But what does quote unquote justice and or accountability look like to all of you in your various roles in cases of sexual violence? Mainly in regard to your particular what your office policy would emphasize, but you can feel free to share that personally. And then how can you fulfill the responsibilities of your office in the way that they, mandate quote unquote justice, while still honoring what an individual or a survivor's idea of justice would be, whether that is, some kind of punitive punishment or restorative justice avenue, if those things may not exist or exist in a different way than they would kind of like to see. How do you handle that? How can we respect that and kind of help them in that best way, even though those practices may not exist yet?
I think that closure and justice does look different for everybody. I really struggled with my case particularly because I did wait to report it. And a shortcoming of Rutgers is that I was told that they only keep residence hall video footage for 30 days. If they kept it longer, I would have been able to see my the person who assaulted me on video, but that wasn't an option for me. So I really struggled with that. It made me very critical of Rutgers as a whole and what more that they could do for people, because reporting within 30 days is not attainable for everybody. So, and then after a while, it's just not having an answer and not knowing who assaulted me made my healing a lot harder. It made me constantly afraid of anybody who faintly resembled him. So I think that healing is definitely individual. It took me a lot, and I'm a spiritual person, so I kind of took comfort in knowing that the negative energy that he put out is going to come back to him. And I hope that, universe and karma kind of sorts that out for me if the legal justice system can't. And like I said, through my work, I found a lot of healing. But it's definitely very, very individual.
You mentioned two concepts, which was justice and accountability. And I think they're so different. I, for one, want to see a defendant accountable. And by accountable, just put through the paces of a trial, of standing before a jury and having to answer to the jury, to the judge, to the court, to the victim for what occurred. I think justice is, I don't know that you can ever really achieve justice, to be honest. I mean, I've just tried to work towards accountability because justice is, like Jacqueline said, it's different for everybody. And I don't know that it's ever 100% achieved.
Thank you both for sharing. And Jamie, I'd love to hear from you. And I agree that closure is so different for everyone, and accountability and justice can never look the same. And I appreciate you sharing your ways in which you've tried to get that for people. Go ahead, Jamie. I'm sorry.
Okay. I think maybe from the law enforcement perspective, it may not be what justice looks like, but maybe helping the victim survivor, the reporting party, whatever, term that people are comfortable with, understand the beginnings of what justice could mean for them, by depending on where they start the process, knowing, the different components, what the options are, whether it is the collection of evidence, what you're comfortable with, filing the report, starting the beginning of communication, taking advantage of the state and county resources that are available. Just providing that beginning understanding through the initial reporting process, through many times, often the first time that they may have a medical referral for many people, it allows them to look and say and define, again, to echo what Jacqueline and Lori are stating, what individually that means to them. I think if we start giving hard and fast statements of justice is this, it dishonors that people have individual experiences. And some people are ready for certain things at certain times. Some people aren't. Some people have different periods. And, in doing this work, which is truly service work, we have to be mindful of that what we may think is important is not necessarily what is going to be important for the people that we're trying to serve and assist.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
That was such a great question. And I think too, it's, I agree with all the sentiments that were shared, that it looks different for everyone. I think, just in the work that I've done, I see one of the biggest, I don't want to use the word justice, but what makes a survivor feel the best a lot of times, and that's not to generalize, is when that veil is lifted of the perception of the perpetrator. And what I mean by that is, so often the perpetrator is regaled as this great person, whether it's on a college campus or in a community, or they're an active working member of a church. And so people only see this good, positive side of this individual and struggle to really see the evil that this individual has caused to a person or a party. And so I think it may not come through law enforcement, it may not come through reporting, it may not come through, but I think, Jacqueline, you had mentioned the idea of karma. And so I think a lot of times that looks like when people start to see, and I think that really goes hand in hand with believing the survivor, because I think a lot of the disbelief of the survivor is not this person, he, she, they would never. And when people start to have that awakening of, I believe you and I believe that they did. And so I've found in my work that that's one of the most, one of the situations in which survivors feel the most validated and I guess justice. Are there any last thoughts from all of our panelists have shared such amazing, helpful, wonderful information? Is there anything else that you would like to share, that you would like to put out there, anything you'd like to leave us with? No pressure.
Just that I guess addressing systems that made people assaulters is just like, to me, like one other definition of justice. Like, it's always good when someone is held accountable for their crimes, but again, they're just unfortunately one in like this massive system that just keeps perpetuating. So I think also just addressing the issue before it gets to the point of someone committing the crime is, I guess, like my idea of justice.
Absolutely. And I think the goal is to, provide prevention, education, and to do the work, the before work, right? To talk about, to open up conversations about mental health, to open up conversations about, to open up conversations with members of population who are the most vulnerable, to provide education, to have conversations about masculinity and healthy masculinity and what that means, and what media messages are we consuming, and what that looks like. And that's all work that we're doing with our campus. So in the interest of time, I will I'll bring our panel to a close, but I want to extend a very, very heartfelt thank you to all of our panelists. Because it's so, I love the work that we do, but I don't think we can do the work that we do without a community approach. And I think that for our students, being able to see different aspects of the justice process, or different aspects of, or even just to see, to hear from someone who identifies as a survivor and their journey and what disclosure looks like, hopefully it makes, if someone is a survivor, it makes their disclosure process a little easier. And also recognizing that there's people that genuinely care, and that there's people that genuinely want to do good, and that genuinely believe survivors, and come with all the concern and empathy. So thank you to each and every one of you. I appreciate your time. And I hope you have a wonderful evening. And thank you so much for being a part of our program this evening.
Thank you for hosting, Christy.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Christy.
Hope you all have a wonderful night.
Thanks.